Hi Class T, it is time to read some more of Mr. Penguin and the Fortress of Secrets. Chapter 13, Master of Disguise. It was almost midnight, and the trap was set. Gordon was happily standing in the sawdust in Colonel Tuftybum's cage, dressed in his new hamster costume, quickly made from cotton wool and sticky tape. Mr. Penguin was hiding behind a curtain keeping watch. Everyone else was asleep. Colin had taken the previous shift and was now lying upside down in the bin on a bed of crumpled paper and a banana skin. He was still meant to be on high alert, but he was actually snoring like a motorbike engine while doing the odd, sleepy kung fu kick. Kapow! It'd been a busy night putting Mr. Penguin's plan into action. While Edith and Colin squeezed Gordon into his costume and popped him in the cage, Mr. Penguin and the twins had taken a snow-crunching walk around the town square. They talked in loud, clear voices about the new hamster in Liesel and Dieter's bedroom above the bakery. They wanted any thief that was earwagging to know exactly where to burgle next. Then Mr. Penguin had done lots of pretend yawning and shouted about how tired everyone was and that they would all absolutely definitely fall asleep immediately. Then they'd all bustled back into the bakery to wait. Behind the curtain, Mr. Penguin didn't need to pretend to yawn. He was doing it for real. The last 24 hours had been bonkers, and his eyelids were drooping. He slapped his face with a flipper. "Come on, Mr. Penguin," he scolded himself in a whisper. "This all depends on you. You need to catch this thief, then you'll be able to have a good sleep. And after that, a lovely breakfast." Breakfast. Now that was a jolly thought. Mr. Penguin closed his eyes and thought happily about warm pastries and nice cups of tea, maybe even some fish paste on hot toast. And with that, Mr. Penguin started to snore. The Von Klonker clock struck midnight, and all was still. In a storm drain opposite the bakery, two glowing yellow eyes blinked. The owner of the eyes glanced about. When it was sure it was alone, it slithered out from its hiding place and wriggled across the snowy cobbles. It shimmied silently up the bakery's drainpipe, onto the roof, and glided across the tiles. Then it carefully ducked its head into the attic through the gap in the window left open for the telescope to poke through. Everyone was asleep. Two children in their beds, a large, hairy spider in the bin, an elderly woman with a bum bag on a camp bed, and a small, rather portly penguin badly hidden behind a curtain. He was snoring, but kept licking his beak and mumbling about fish finger sandwiches. And there, in a very fancy cage, was the reason for the creature's visit. A hamster, standing in the stardust, cooing. The intruder slithered over, but paused as it got closer. The animal in the cage looked like a rather unusual sort of hamster. Most unusual indeed. But the boss had been clear. Steal every rodent in the village. The creature opened the door with its tail and carefully picked up the hamster in its mouth. Then it slithered back to the window, but it was just a little bit too hasty. As it wriggled outside, it knocked the telescope, which clattered to the floor. The window slammed shut and trapped the end of its tail. The creature panicked, pulling to try to free itself. The strange hamster in its mouth started to coo in a bewildered manner. Mr. Penguin's eyes snapped open. What was that noise? What was happening? Was it time for breakfast? He glanced about. Was someone in the room? The cage on the desk was empty. Where was Gordon? His eyes swiveled to the window and nearly popped out of his head. There, with its tail caught in a sash window, was a snake. Snake! Yelled Mr. Penguin. Snake! Chapter 14. A Plan. Utter pandemonium. Everyone woke to Mr. Penguin running about, wagging his fingers above his head and yelling. On the roof outside, the snake kept trying to wrestle itself free from the closed window. Colin was the first to snap into action. He scribbled on his pad, "Don't panic. I am fully in control of this situation." Then he took a flying leap towards the window, with his eyebrow furrowed and his kung fu legs kicking. Kapow! Mr. Penguin, however, was not in control of the situation. Instead, he was swirling about like a tornado with his satchel swinging about, swiping everything off every surface. Bang! Crash! As Colin jumped towards the window, Mr. Penguin collided with him, and Colin went boinging back across the room. He hit the door and slid to the floor with his head spinning. With a heave, the snake managed to free itself, and the window slammed shut. "Gordon! He's taken Gordon!" cried Edith. "Somebody do something!" She dashed across the room and threw the window wide open. Icy air blasted into the room as Edith watched the snake, with Gordon, unflustered, in its mouth, rattle down the roof tiles and over the gutter. Colin shook his head to clear the swirl of stars and little penguin images that were dancing around him, then took a flying leap. He bounced off Mr. Penguin's tummy again, boing, and shot right out of the open window. "Quick!" yelled Dieter and Liesel. Without wasting a moment, they ran out of the room, down the stairs, with Edith at their heels. Mr. Penguin waddled as fast as he could behind them. They burst out of the front door onto the snowy street, just in time to see the snake. Gordon and then Colin slid down the side of the bakery and over the snow-covered canopy above the shop windows. A mini avalanche fell in a big lump on the adventurers and landed in a pile on the pavement. The snake dithered. Snow had blocked its storm drain. How was it going to escape? The adventurers grabbed at it all at once, bumping their heads together and falling on their bottoms in the snow. In the confusion, the snake made a wiggly dash for it across the town square, the creature glowing in the light of the enormous clock. Kapow! Colin Kung Fu kicked his way out of his snowy prison and gave chase, skittering and sliding across the icy ground while holding up his pad. It said, "Stop," and "Wait," and also, "I will catch you." Mr. Penguin, Edith, and the twins followed Colin, pleading for the snake to drop Gordon. "How do I get myself into these situations?" wondered Mr. Penguin, puffing and panting his way across the town square. He had to run with both flippers holding his hat firmly in place. Sleepy faces appeared at windows, woken by the commotion. Soon, a yawning crowd had staggered into the streets in their jimmy jams, many with rollers still in their hair. The snake slithered between all the legs and glanced over what would be its shoulder, if it had a shoulder. The spider and the penguin were gaining on it. The snake doubled its speed. It was exhausting. The funny-looking hamster in its mouth was really rather heavy. Eventually, the snake found another storm drain. Mr. Penguin and Colin took a giant leap to catch it, but it was too quick and slithered into the hole. Colin went to follow it, but Mr. Penguin grabbed him. "But it's getting away," said Colin's pad. Mr. Penguin tried to answer, but was completely out of puff. "You can't follow it, Colin," he managed after a full minute of wheezing. "There could more snakes waiting to gobble you up." Then he threw himself on the ground and wafted his pink face with his hat. By now, Edith and the twins had arrived beside them. Edith turned around and faced the villagers. "Where does that drain go?" she demanded. "We'll have to follow it to get my garden back." A very elderly, wrinkly old man stepped forward. He looked like a tortoise in a nightshirt. "My old granddad told me our drains connected to the ones that came from the fortress." Everyone looked at the fortress. It rose grimly above a thick, freezing mist, with dim yellow lights in the thin windows and smoke billowing out of its chimneys. "Come on," said Edith, tightening the strap of her bum bag. "Let's go." "But you'll never climb it," said the old man. "There's bears and wolves and ice and thorns." Edith stood silently, chewing her bottom lip and looking at Mr. Penguin. He shifted, feeling discombobulated. The other mountain sounded very dangerous, and that snake had big teeth that Mr. Penguin was sure would love to nibble on a penguin. But on the other hand, Gordon was their friend. More than that, he was one of their special adventure gang. Mr. Penguin took a deep breath, stood up, and plonked his hat back on his head. "We must rescue Gordon," he said, fussing with his bow tie, "and all the other pets that are trapped in the fortress." Then he said, "But I'm not quite sure how we'll get there." The crowd cheered, just as the Von Klonker clock struck midnight. A heavy boing sounded, a door flew open, and out popped a large metal bird, bottom first. It had one eyelid twitching and only one of its wings flapping. The mechanical bird turned, opened its beak, and hollered an awful tinny verse of the national anthem, then disappeared inside the clock. "That really needs fixing," tutted someone in the crowd. Beside Mr. Penguin, Liesel was staring at the clock. Her eyes gleamed. "We're going to fly to the fortress," she announced. Everyone hurrahed again, including Mr. Penguin. Then he stopped and said, "Hang on. Our plane's in tatters." Liesel grinned. "I think there's another way." As I hypnotised every single person in the audience that night, you could have heard a pin drop. All eyes were on me, and the air tingled and fizzed and rippled and wobbled. It was incredible. I felt I could have done anything, but then my father had to ruin it. He heard the silence from my dressing room backstage, where he'd been combing his moustache. He ran in to see what was happening and quickly realised what I'd managed to do. He darted onto the stage and slipped my dark glasses over my eyes, breaking the spell. Polite applause broke out, even though no one in the theatre knew what had just happened. When I looked at my father, I could tell he was angry, but also frightened. I was too powerful. He told me later that I'd looked like a wild animal on the stage. Shortly after that, I packed my bags and ran away. And I've never been working on my diabolical plan ever since. I wonder if the two are linked. That's the end of our reading for today. Keep safe and keep washing those hands.